welcome. Thank you. So welcome to the first of several forums to discuss the potential override. We're going to start with some introductions. Then we're going to have a short presentation from the school department and the town administrator. Then we'll move into a facilitated question and answer session and try to wrap up by 8:30. We know we'll get kicked out of the library starting around 8:45. So questions? Who has the mic and is going to be going around? Okay, so for answering questions, there will be someone circulating with the mic. So when we get to that point, you can just raise your hand. So just to set some ground rules or some understanding, this forum is so that we can share clear information with the public. We want to facilitate everyone's understanding, so this is a question and answer type format. We want to encourage community input, and I'm so pleased to see so many people here the day after a holiday and a snowstorm. We're hoping we can address some misconceptions. We have been receiving a lot of questions from the public, and hoping that this will be an opportunity to provide some clear answers to some of those misconceptions. And, you know, ultimately the goal is to build trust and transparency as we go through this together as a town. Oh, introductions.
So I'm Catherine Coughlin, Chair of the Select Board.
And Elise Gorseth, Vice Chair of the School Committee. And then we have our town representatives and school representatives.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jamie Erickson. I'm the town administrator. With me in the audience are some town staff members, John Marshall, who's the Deputy Town Administrator for Operations, and Jay Parapatish, who is our Communications Director. And I think that's all from the town staff side, along with John Towns, who's at the end, who's our Deputy TA for Finance.
Hi, Melissa Spash, Superintendent of Schools, and I'm here with a few members of my staff. I'd like to introduce Matt Gillis, Assistant Superintendent of Finance, Business and Finance, Julie Skipper, who's here, who's the Director of HR, and Corey Kerr, who's our Director of Communications.
Can I just quickly mention one quick thing? Well, two quick things. One, thank you to Pegasus for taping tonight. Randy and team, you did a great job. You always do a great job. I want to thank them. But two, there are some lingering potential fire alarm challenges in the library that occurred over the weekend. Fully okay to be here. It's just the alarm panel. If it goes off, the library staff and the fire department are very well aware of what's going on, so they'll be able to fix it expeditiously. I just want people to be aware in case an alarm goes off. It's not because, hopefully not because something's happening. We'll just be able to handle that, and we're prepared for that for this evening. So in case you saw things on Facebook or in case the alarm actually goes off. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Erickson. I'm going to cover some norms for tonight's meeting. Speakers will be asked to introduce themselves and indicate whether they're a Natick resident or a business owner. You need not be either to ask questions. That's just for our information. All questions will be directed to the forum moderators, which are me and Elise. Each speaker may ask 2 questions or 1 question and a follow-up until everyone in attendance has had an opportunity to speak, and time permitting, a second opportunity to speak will be provided. We want to give everybody an opportunity to participate. Out of courtesy to others, please refrain from side discussions in the room and take those into the hallway. Thank you.
So we'll turn things over to Dr. Spash and Mr. Erickson for a brief presentation.
Ooh. Let me just grab the clicker. We did not have a chance, unfortunately, to choreograph too much this evening, so if we feel a little bit discombobulated up here, it's just we're doing it on the fly. I'm just going to take a couple seconds or minutes to just quickly, high level, set the stage as to what an override is. And a lot of this material is directly from the state's Department of Revenue website. And then I'll also just flash a couple slides up that were previously presented to the Select Board and the School Committee just regarding what is being asked of the Natick community currently. But What an override. Proposition 2.5 override. Proposition 2.5 refers to the mass law that was enacted in the 1980s. And it basically limits the amount of property tax revenue a community can raise from real and personal property taxes. It limits the overall amount, which is called the tax levy, and how much that levy can basically increase year over year. Not an individual's tax, but just the overall pool of money that a community can raise. And that's called the tax levy or the levy limit, which is the limit of the annual basis for raising taxes. Under Prop 2.5, a community levy can increase by automatically by two factors. An incremental increase of 2.5% over the prior year's levy. That's why it's called Prop 2.5. And then you can also add in new growth. So when somebody adds an addition to their house or when a new business invests in the property, that's considered new growth. That can also be added to that levy. So those two factors automatically increase year over year, and that's where the Prop 2.5 term comes from. The increase is basically that 2.5% plus new growth, and that basically becomes the next year's or the new year's, the upcoming year's levy. And that's what we can basically, as a community, tax up to. The increase applies to the entire levy, so it's not an individual property bill. So if you invest in your property, you're probably going to have a higher bill because your value of your property has actually gone up. That's part of that new growth. Another factor is basically how the tax is the valuation overall. So for example, if residential overall property values increase greater than commercial values or vice versa, that shifts the responsibility to commercial and or residential properties in a different way proportionally. And that also might have a net positive or negative impact on your overall levy. So that's why 2.5 isn't to the individual, it's to the overall levy. A common misperception, and this is what I was just talked about, is that it's basically on the property bill can increase 2.5%. That's incorrect. And taxes on your house are based on the assessed value of your property. And we have a very talented assessing department that does amazing work and fair work for the valuation of our properties, and a lot of work actually on the personal and commercial side. A community can exceed its levy with a voter approval. That's what we're talking about, an override. An override is a voter approval. So you go to the vote of the voters to seek approval to increase that levy more than that automatic 2.5% plus new growth. An override must be set at a dollar amount. That's why a lot of our discussions are around a set dollar amount. And it's the majority vote of the voters, basically by a ballot. Only the select board can place items on a ballot. That's why we have the select board so heavily involved in this process. They're the ones that ultimately determine, should we take this to the vote of the voters? By passing an override, basically that levy limit is a permanent increase to the community. There are options to do what's called an underride, which is a vote of the voters to reduce it. So you can go up or you can go down. Underrides are very uncommon. I'm not familiar with really any community that has done that. Overrides are more what you hear, but it is technically possible to do that. And then an override can be used for really all types of things that are typical of budget. It's basically another revenue source. You can use it for educating students, use it for paving roads, for making park improvements. You can technically, if you can do it under the levy limit, you can do capital projects like building new schools or other facilities. Those are the basics of Prop 2.5. So that's just hoping to educate folks about what it is and why we're here and why it's important for a community to understand that as you go to the ballot to, if you're ever asked to vote on something, which is what are intended for this conversation. For Natick, the history has been, there's been two in the 90s where they were failed ballot votes. Both were related to the school. This is directly from the DLS website. You can actually research this. It has actually a history of all of the overrides under Prop 2.5 in the state. There's a whole database. You can export it. It's really interesting, actually. And then there's two that were successful, one in 2001 for public safety, implementing a second ambulance, and then one in 2009, which is actually very similar to the one that's being discussed now, which is for general operating to fund operating and school budget. That one was $3.9 million. It's actually comparable in scale to the overall budget as the one that we're talking about amount this time around of 8 million, roughly 4%. I think it's just shy of 4%. The one currently at 8 million is just north of 4%. A lot of the information that you're seeing here is also in the presentation, which is on the override website, the natickma.gov website, that was presented to the joint meeting of the school committee and the select board on December 16th. This is a slide around our free cash spending plan. I'm not going to go into detail. I just want people to be aware of it because free cash comes in a lot to the discussion around an override. So if questions come up tonight, we have the materials. We can answer them. But really, I wanted to hash through, this is the current, and it's a little bit odd with the shading, but this is the current, this is again what was presented on December 16th, and it talks about the $8 million ask that we're talking about in the current dialogue around an override. And you'll see there are two components that make up the $8 million. We have a $4 million component that would actually reduce our use of free cash. That's why the previous slide on free cash spending might be relevant to questions tonight. Basically, free cash is a one-time funding source that, yes, happens annually, but it's not a predictable funding source. It's not like it's tax levy. It's basically unspent funds, among other things, at the end of the year that we calculate and then get certified by the state. It's not recommended to use for operational purposes, but many towns do, and Natick has a very long history of doing that. It's not a bad thing. It's just not recommended. But with no override, we'd have to use a lot more. With an override, we're trying to use less. What that does mean, if you look back at the free cash spending plan, is that we can put a lot more money towards stabilization and capital. With no override, it's going to be extremely challenging to put money towards capital. One example of capital is a fire alarm box for the library. It would be great to be able to replace that. We need that money in our capital program to be able to do that. And then another $4 million for directly into the operational purposes for schools and town and shared expenses. Shared services are things like they're shared between the school and the town, such as healthcare costs, capital debt service, so debt service is part of that, among many other costs. We'll get into more detail in the weeks ahead. We do have our line-by-line budget items coming out at the beginning of February, and the school department is going to go into more detail right now about even some of the school-related costs that make up the $2.7 million in part of the override discussion, as well as their background into the dialogue around the override tonight. I will pass it over to Melissa.
Thank you. We're going to do questions all around after? Okay, great. Do you want to switch the deck? We're just going to switch decks. Top right. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Great. So we wanted to start out, first of all, good evening. Great to see everyone here, and thanks for being here. We wanted to start out, as Jamie said, to kind of go through why the 2.8 million number. So this is a little bit number and a lot of detail, but it's worth kind of going through to ground the conversation that's going to move us into the $2.8 million. So the budget for this year, 2024-25, this was approved. Our appropriation from the town was $87.2 million. We added, and we've kind of been talking about this a bit, $2 million from a circuit breaker fund. That's one-time money use from our side. We have a memo, great detail. If anybody wants to get deep in the details or that, or later in the questions, we'd be happy to. But essentially, it's a use of one-time funds this year that was agreed upon last budget cycle, not just by the school committee, but through the process of the budget review from the town. We actually, early on this year, immediately, I've been here 5 months, by the way, so as I came in, we very early saw that we wanted to really reduce the draw on the circuit breaker, and so we instituted $400,000 more of savings. You can see that there. So we're calling our kind of spend level at $88.8 million this year. When we did our first roll-up, there's a kind of a term in many budgets called level servicing. That means if we kept everything the same, we kept all the same people, all the same services, it would have been $96.9 million. When you read our budget book, which we'll release very shortly, it's going to show in greater detail than I think has been shown before, the drivers of all of those expenses, very transparently. It's still 10 more days or whatever it is before we owe the budget, so we're not going to cover that here, but we are committing to that for you. But the level service would have been $96.9 million. And the town budget, which was quite generous at 6.29%, was 92.7. That's the same number on Jamie's prior slide. So the shortfall there is $4.2 million. Seeing that, we had a lot of talks with the school committee within our own departments and really came up with a plan to reduce another $1 million for the FY26 budget and to carry forward this $400,000. So we took another $1.4 million off, which brings us to a shortfall of $2.8 million. And that's where the override comes in. So the override, if there were no override, we would be cutting or reducing by $2.8 million. We put a little note there for context. Schools run on cycles and hiring cycles that are annual that happen really in the spring. And so I think sometimes we have natural talk or analytical talk around, like, could we do this next fall or could we do it? If we end up doing this, these decisions would have to be made this spring because we owe that to people to go and look for their next job if that's what the case is. So I'm just naming that there's a very different cycle. There's principal positions right now in the state being posted. There soon will be many teachers. It's a different cycle than normal because it's student-facing positions that are needed in classrooms. So we're actually coming out with the narrative around very precisely what those reductions would be. We're in the process of really mentioning this to our own staff within the schools to be very transparent, but today we're going to really give you the narrative. I'm new to many of you, and hopefully you'll come to know me as a very straight shooter. I have nothing to lose in that. I need to say it like it is and then stick to it, so I'm giving you that commitment as I'm talking through this today. When I go through all of these cuts, I want to also mention the collaborative process that was put in place to get to this. It was first with a cabinet, which is all the leaders of the district, and then it went to every single principal in a collaborative session to really say, this feels right. And you'll see that these proposed reductions, were there to be no override passing, cut across all schools. There's no hysterics here. There's not some burning dumpster floating down the river. It's truly what we think we're going to do and truly cuts across all schools. Here's the big picture, which is about $2.1 million of cuts in actual staff. And I'll go through each and every one of them. That's 39 to 41 FTE. FTE stands for full-time equivalent. Is that me? Okay. It also includes fee increases that would be transferred over to parents or families' caregivers, and another cut on curricular resources, which we are doing quite a bit of in that $1 million reduction I already talked about. And if you're unfamiliar, we've already cut $1,050,000 from in this year's budget from last year in that $400,000. So there's already $2 million of cuts in next year's plan. That 2.8 would now make up 4.8 million. That's basically an elementary school. It's actually more than an elementary school. I have friends in other districts who that is literally what they're cutting, instead of cutting it across the district. So, predominantly people at this point, because it's lean enough that that's where it is. Now we're going to go through each of the line-by-line items. The first one is teachers. That's 10 to 12 FTEs. This estimate can vary if you know a little bit about schools. As a position is eliminated, it moves through the union process and kind of goes to the newest people. And so we're saying it's 10 to 12 as an estimate, but that's pretty tight. And Matt's going to take us through. Matt, where are you? Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. So how would this impact? I think we got to shut off the other mics. So how would this impact our schools? Well, starting with the high school, if we're reducing teachers, and not all those 10 to 12 would necessarily be right at the high school. We'd reduce access to some preferred or required classes and limited progression opportunities, especially at the high school level. So that means we might have fewer AP math classes, as an example, for kids to progress through, or fewer foreign language classes for a third or fourth year or an AP offering. It would also reduce some of the diversity of course offerings. If we have to take out, if we have to reduce a teacher and they teach 5 classes, that's 5 less classes that get taught, and so class size goes up, right? And one of the ways we can mitigate that is a shift to online AP classes. but it's not the same. We went through online learning not too long ago. We have a strong preference to in-person learning. At the middle school, it'd be a little bit different, where we'd see up to a 10% increase in class sizes, because their schedule runs different than a high school schedule. And at the elementary school, we'd see class sizes go up to 25 students. Currently the average is around 20. So this would be a pretty significant impact for the amount of attention individual students could get from a teacher at a time. I'm going to hand this one back to the superintendent. This is right in her wheelhouse.
I do love instruction. So this idea of reduced individual attention, you'll see that as we kind of continue through. A lot of some of the strength in education is when we can get to every single student and what they need. And so with less teachers, there's just less availability to do that really well in a classroom. And then increased teacher workload. You probably hear it all the time, not only in Natick, but in the news, about how teachers are feeling about their workloads, how much they're taking home. So, cutting these teachers puts that burden on other classes. Simply put, you have 5 more kids in your class, you're correcting that much more, and you're facilitating that much more during class. Do you want me to do the next one, or you got it? So the impact on student outcomes, fewer opportunities to explore interests and achieve academic goals, and then reduce competitiveness for college admissions. If all of a sudden we're offering less things, or people are taking courses online for AP, that is not desired. I think we offer 26 AP courses, and our kids scored above the national average, actually, in 25 out of 26 of those. This is huge. We do not want to see that go down. So that competitiveness, that's kind of the anecdote to help interpret that. And then just scholarships and career readiness can have some effect. Here's the next layer. Interventionists. Right now we have 32.6 interventionists across the district, predominantly in elementary schools. Those would fully be eliminated. So imagine interventionists right now. I go into a class, I see 3, 4 people sometimes, and they're literally with different groups, with the lowest readers, with the highest. They're giving the acceleration and the remediation as well as to the middle. And that would be impossible with 32.6 people not here. The flip to that, because it's a net impact of 13.6, is that we would add K1 paraprofessionals to assist in those 2 grades, because there's a lot more need, a lot more kids there. And that's just to alleviate and kind of make sense for the teacher and the workload. That would reduce the capacity for targeted intervention, which is very significant right now. I'm going to add there, which I didn't plan to, but the science of reading, which is actually a big thing and something we're rolling out significantly, it requires small group work to do the phonics. That is a piece of the model. And so this makes me worried about our ability to roll out a literacy plan. Personalized learning coaches, 3 of those will be eliminated. These are people who work across the district on innovation, on pedagogy, on driving and instructional vision throughout the district. Disruption to continuous improvement efforts, and challenges in maintaining system alignment. Because think about it, when you have 8 schools, you have to be making sure that instructional vision is pushed through the entire system. And these are the people who are critical in that work. Literacy coaches, 2 of those. Again, concerns with rolling out the strategic literacy plan. Many of you know we're in a literacy audit right now based on our current curricular materials. That's a cross-functional team of teachers, administrators, families, students. There's many people represented on this team to make that decision. So we're concerned about that, as well as just impacting critical stages of skill acquisition around language development. Special education paraprofessionals, reducing specialized support in inclusive classrooms, and then library professionals, paraprofessionals. There's 2 right now at the middle school and 2 at the high school, and we would be reducing 2 of those. Do you want to take it there?
We'll give the superintendent a break. So administrative assistants, this would actually put a little more burden on administrators that we're hoping would be focusing on some other things. They would have to do some more clerical and administrative tasks on their own. It's not really the best use of their time. And it would delay sometimes communications with students and families, because that's only one person to be able to help respond and get back to things. And information technology, we'd have fewer technicians available to help us resolve tech issues. We've got 6,000 students. We've got almost 1,000 different bodies in there with staff, 8,000 devices, and we use them pretty frequently to help us keep things operating smoothly. An executive function tutor, this is something we have at the middle school, and this helps students both on IEPs and not on IEPs. An IEP is an individual education plan. It's a contractual obligation to provide services, and this person helps middle school age students make better decisions and choices to get through the day and process all these things. But this would be one of those things that we wouldn't be able to continue. Assistive technology assistant. This person helps the teachers, a variety of them, with students with a bunch of different disabilities. It could be headphones, could be an iPad, could be something else for help the student communicate and access the curriculum. We have dozens of different pieces of equipment, and one person sort of corrals all that and helps staff work with the kids so they can communicate and receive the curriculum effectively. Last but not least on this slide is the Assistant Director of Athletics. We have a pretty big and robust athletic program, runs over $1.5 million, and so we have a part-time assistant director, and that position would be reduced. She also coaches for us as well. And it's a little tough talking about positions when we've got 1.0s and 0.4s here. We've already sort of been reaching out to staff today to let them know this would be a public discussion, because they really should, be able to hear about it in another way. But we can't really proceed with a need for an override without talking about some of the things we would be giving up. Next slide. Yep. Okay, so this would be the user fees. And these would be sort of round numbers, because we don't exactly have, we have a pretty good idea, but we don't know exactly how many people are going to continue to pay, so we have to estimate whenever a fee goes up. Everybody's gone to the grocery store the last few years, and at some point you said, I'm not going to pay that much for those eggs, or I'm not going to pay that for, Tropicana orange juice. I'm going to look for the frozen concentrate. You make some type of adjustment or decision. So we've done some surveys and comparisons with athletic fees in the area, also with costs with our sports, and we'll have a cost that goes up there for the different sports and different programs. They're listed there to better reflect what it costs to play and more reasonably. Transportation, the bus fee hasn't gone up in a number of years. The town has always, almost always supported that program with a separate warrant article. We understand that's going away. And if the override doesn't pass, we would be looking to increase the transportation fee as well. Field trips, this one I've been told pains more than one school committee member, as they tried to make this in the last few years grow so that we could be more equitable and provide more access to some of the great things and educational things around eastern Massachusetts, and that would be reduced, and we would just be budgeting some money set aside for the families that really could not afford to send their kids at all, and the rest would be on the families to pay and the PTOs to fundraise for, and that's $480,000, or almost $500,000 worth of fees that would get passed directly back to the actual users.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
The last chunk of $250,000, again, we've already made quite a few reductions in this area. High-quality curricular materials, that's actually not my word, that's Department of Ed's word for evidence-based strategies. It's a moral imperative to give all of our students high-quality curricular materials. There's many ways to measure this. It's not the world according to Melissa. It actually is an independent source who measures the quality of curriculum. I'll talk more about this in my entry plan that I'm going to deliver in a few weeks. But here, this follows almost $250,000 in plans next year as part of our $1 million of cuts. And it jeopardizes, again, that literacy audit where we're coming out with a proposal for a new literacy curriculum in our elementary schools in the years to come. We're concerned about the impact on learning and achievement if that happens. And then professional development. Again, we've already cut professional development this year. Teachers spend quite a bit of time in professional development on all things from pedagogy to actually learning how to use these new curricula. I think that one of the biggest assets in Natick are our teachers. And they deserve to have training, and they deserve their part of a state-of-the-art organization, and PD is a big piece of that. This is really just a summary slide of kind of all of those pieces together. So the impact of a no override vote would be $2.8 million in additional cuts to schools on top of the $2,050,000 that we already have planned for this year and next. That's $4.8 million over the amount of a budget for one elementary school. We have impacts, which we've just covered, so I'm not going to read the slide, but there's staffing impacts, class size and offering impacts, instructional implication, and service fees for our caregivers and families. So without the override, generally fewer opportunities and a greater impact on students. Yeah, that's what we have. Thank you.
Okay, so we're ready to go into Q&A. So please just raise your hand and the mic will come to you. And if you don't mind standing up, that would be super. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karen Edelman Foster. I live in Natick. Thank you very much for those presentations. Really instructive. Appreciate that. I especially appreciated hearing about the details of what that $2,777,000, et cetera, dollars to the schools would be used for. And I do feel like I have a concrete sense of what that will be used for. Of course, it's an $8 million ask that we've been discussing. So I'm wondering if someone could give some more color to the rest of that. I know that some of it is to prevent cuts in services on the town side. I know some of it is to prevent shared services cuts. I know some of it is to reduce the use of free cash, and I think it's really hard to visualize what that actually means on the ground. So if someone could step through, more of the detail on that, I think that would be really, really helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Is the presentation from the 16th possible to pull up?
Yeah, I have that.
So some of those details were presented previously to the public, so that's why we didn't decide to present it again this evening. But on the 16th, which was a joint presentation to the Select Board and the School Committee, we did talk a lot about what on the town side or non-school side would be presented, along with the 2.8 roughly of 2.8 million on the school side. So on the town side, it's approximately 1.8 total. But that includes shared services, correct?
Is there a slide you want me to go to?
Right, 1.5 with the town and then additional $300,000 of shared services. So 1.5 in the town. If you can go to, do you recall which slide it is, John?
The clicker should be working, but
Oh, I can go.
this is a PDF.
Yep, I'll go to it.
Oh, there you go.
So this was the presentation on the 16th, and I'll just go to the slide that talks about so here's the 1.8 or 1.62, which talks about the cuts on the town side, and then the approximate 400,000 or so on the shared services side. On the town side, this is equivalent to about 6.5 full-time positions, and similar to the schools, it depends on the final day of what those positions are because of union contracts. Those are in our fire department, our police department, and DPW primarily, along with facilities. They're currently vacant positions, not that they're not needed, they just happen to be currently vacant. So we're just not filling them. We put a hiring freeze in place so that we aren't filling those in the case where an override does not happen. They would basically be helping public safety, fire ambulance service, police service, DPW, which picks up all of our trash and handles support for special events and all the things that DPW, plowing, all of the other things that DPW does, along with facilities, so maintenance of our buildings. In addition, there are some department service savings. The details will come out in early February. Those are things like efficiencies or other things that we found we can cut for the year. It will likely mean that if it's reoccurring over many years, that things like our facilities and like our public works will not be able to sustain those cuts. But those are things that we felt, at least for 1 year, we could do without. And then reducing operational costs. Some of those are just efficiencies that we're able to find. And then on the shared services side, that's primarily debt service. Debt service is basically the cost that supports our capital program. So that's why if we have no override, I said this at the select board meeting last week, basically there's no more capital. We have a $16 million capital program for next year alone. And we have a 5-year capital program that's outlined on the town's website. Of that 16 million, typically about 12 million comes forward over the course of a year because, we have, it's a moment in time. I always call a capital program a living document, so we're obligated to produce it on January 1 of every year for a 5-year span. We always sort of put more in there, knowing that we're going to reduce it as I go into town meeting. Ultimately, town meeting votes on the capital program. But in brief, if we have no override, we basically have no capital program for next year, which means those $16 or $12 million worth of projects, which includes upgrades to our facilities like the alarm system here in this building, or like improvements to the sprinkler system at Benham School, or other improvements to all of our town and school facilities, as well as our vehicle fleet, which supports our police departments, which supports our fire department, which supports our trash and recycling pickup. Those won't be funded for the year. All those funds get pushed to the next year. The next year, year 2 of the capital program, if you pull the program, is about $20 million of that. So now we have 20 plus 16, so about $36 million in year 2. It just exacerbates the issue with not funding the capital program. That shared services covers the debt service, which allows us to do capital. The other $4 million, as I mentioned earlier, anytime we can reduce the use of free cash in our operational budget is a benefit. It's theoretically, we should be spending 0 of free cash. Historically, Natick has been spending anywhere pre-pandemic in the $2 to $2.5 to $3 million range for many, many years. And that's okay. It's not a bad thing. It's just ideally you'd be spending 0 because free cash is considered a one-time fund. With no override, next year we'd have to spend at least $6.5 million, and that's in addition to the cuts mentioned tonight from the town and the school side. So we have a certified free cash of 7.8 million. So even if we want to spend all that certified free cash on operations, we wouldn't be able to cover all of the cuts, all of the budget, and we'd have no capital program for next year. So our proposal includes $4 million reduction in use of free cash. That brings that down to $2.5 million, which is in line with pre-pandemic levels. That means that we can free up that $4 million to then put towards our capital program and paying things like stabilization accounts and OPEB, which is basically an unfunded liability for their post-employment benefits for folks who used to work for the town, basically, that we're obligated to pay. So the more we can put towards capital, the more we can fund our capital program, the less we can rely on debt. It's a net benefit. So those are the more detailed costs of the $1.8 million in non-school cuts that make up that overall $4 million cost. A lot of that detail is already in the December 16th presentation, as well as the override presentation that was presented to the select board last Wednesday night. We felt it appropriate not to get into that level of detail tonight because we want to have the questions. So I appreciate that question because it is helpful to have the context of the school department details along with the town non-school department details. Happy to answer any follow-up on that front because it can get very technical, and I want to make sure we get to all the questions tonight as well. Just for purposes of the presentation, I'll go to this is that recap that I had presented previously, where you have the $4 million request to reduce our free cash from 6.5 to 2.5, along with the roughly 2.8 in school costs. It says 1 million, but that's really override distribution coming back into the budget. So it's really 1.5 million in town reductions. And then $300,000 in shared services that make up that 8 million. Thanks, Matt, for pulling that.
I can go loudly.
No, we can get the mic. It's better to have the mic, less for us and more for the taping. So
My wife's
if the light's on, then you should be good.
All right. Dan Weddle. I'm a Natick resident since '98. I might know the answer to this. What is the prevalence trend for IEPs over the last couple of years and then going forward? Do you happen to have that data? Thank you.
Right there.
All right.
Yeah, we have it in a couple of places, but do you want to show the one from our deck that shows that increase? It's the same data. It's just in a graph, which is, I think, a little easier to see what you're saying. I can answer the part of projecting the future. That's really hard to do. They are on the rise. It's really student-specific, and so we don't know, other than to say it's on the rise. And you can see, yeah, that, I think it's number 14. Yeah. So here you can see from 2020, 2021, the last 5 years, that red line shows the percentage of kids in Natick on an IEP who receive services in special education. So that's gone from 14.8% to 18.4%. The bottom line is multilingual learners, or ELs, if you're interested in that as well. Do you want to go to the next? Because it's 187 students. Oh, it's actually, just click that clicker. There. So the students with disabilities increased 187 students over 5 years. So a way to think about that, I'm not sure where your question's going, but I'm going to elaborate just a little bit. Most of our students with disabilities learn best in small groups at some point in the day. So if you take that, the small group should be 6 to 8, really not more than 8. So divide 187 by 8, you've got like 25 teachers needing 25 sections just for those kids alone to be receiving those services to help them access the curriculum. So 187 students over 5 years. The ELL population is 121, because sometimes looking at the percents to make it make sense in terms of the actual number of students and the programming needs. And all of these students with disabilities and ELs require targeted supports. They're actually programmatic. Many are legally mandated through the IEP process. For learning, language, and academic goals. And they also require specially licensed staff. So it's required in the IEP to be taught by a student, either a special education or an ESL teacher. So I'm happy to elaborate on that, but that's the trend.
The light's on, it's on.
Donna McKenzie, Natick resident. I'm sorry. Apologies. It's Donna McKenzie, long-time Natick resident, actually graduate of Natick schools, kindergarten to high school, former school committee member. And I just have a question. I really appreciate this new information, especially from the schools. And I appreciate also Karen Edelman-Foster's question, and mine maybe builds on that a little bit. But I note that the school budget includes, even with the override, includes $2 million in cuts. So you're not requesting a level services budget with the override. And I just want to say, that's amazing, because you always think you're going to work magic when you're on a school committee, and there's never enough money for anything that you want to do. So when I look at this, and I know that most of the budget for the town is the schools, I want to throw the challenge back to the town. Has the town made cuts before asking for the override? Have you made similar cuts? And what was the percentage in the 2009 override? Because you're saying it's about, a similar ask in terms of today's money for the override. But what was the percentage? What percentage of that 2009 override went to the schools? What percent went to the town? And can you tell us some cuts that you maybe are making before you're asking for the override? Thank you.
Sure, I appreciate the question. I think one thing to maybe also level set the understanding is, with an override from FY25 to FY26 budget, and it's unrelated to the level service because I understand that there's a lot that went into the current FY25 budget. The no override is a negative year over year for towns of 1.21%, a positive 3.61% for shared services, and a positive 6.29% for schools. That's just to say that even with an override, schools are getting a 6.29% increase, and the town would be getting a 1.21% increase. With an override, the schools would be getting approximately a 10% increase, towns 1.07, shared services 3.87. That's just some context, just because I think it's important to understand the cuts that the towns doing with no override is really year-over-year cuts. We're at level relatively lean shop with level service. We also don't, given the nature of how we budget and how we operate, because it's not based on a school year, it's a little bit of a different process for the town. The superintendent alluded to that when you were talking about how the school needs to budget. You need to make schools need to make decisions now for next fiscal year. We have a little bit more of a fluid process because we can pause on initiatives. We can hold on hiring for 6 months or so. It's just a different budgeting process. That's just to provide just some additional context. In addition, over the last several years, the town has been doing other things with regards to our services. That has included, we've worked to reduce positions across the board. We've worked to, for example, we worked with the school department to not merge our IT departments, but centralize some of our IT oversight. We've also reduced some positions in our Board of Health and Community Economic Development that allowed us to do some other positions that will let us save costs. We've increased revenues. We revamped our building permit fees, which increased revenues significantly. We've revamped our ambulance fees, which have increased revenues significantly. We've gone after non-town funding. We actually received, through town staff support, $2 million to replace the HVAC system at Benham. We brought in $1 million for the system here, and not the fire panel system, but the HVAC system here in this library here. And other sustainability projects to the tune of $1 million. So it's a little bit different because the schools are focused on educating kids. They need to be focused on educating kids. The town is really about running the town. That includes the school facilities. So we are able to increase revenues, seek grant funding, seek other sources of funding that the schools really, we want them to focus on educating the kids. So we're taking the step and the leadership in doing a lot of those other projects that help reduce the town's expenses, that help increase the town's revenue. And because we're doing it really with a lean staff, we have limitations on significant abilities to cut, plus the cuts that we are proposing is about proportional to the town school amount of the budget. The overall budget, including the expenses of the shared services, is about 65 to 70% school related to 30 to 35% non-school related. So $1 million+ on a town budget cut is actually pretty significant for the town because we're representing about 30 to 35% of the overall budget. Just to note, these are some of the increases that we've actually had from our fees. So increased ambulance fees have led to about $200,000 in increases. We are actually working over a multi-year program to increase those fees. And then our revenues from building permits have increased about 58.4% or $2 million since we revamped those fees. And we're seeing additional new growth coming into town, which is a net positive. What we're really grappling with here is just a structural deficit that we need to really fix.
Claudia Trevor Wright. My question is about whether there's been recent benchmarking for teacher compensation against our near peers and our aspirational peers. And I ask because if we're, again, going back to our teachers, like we did during the pandemic when we asked them to forego a cost of living increase, if we're going back to ask for more from them, I'm concerned that we're going to lose them to our competitors in our neighboring towns. And so I'm hopeful that you have some benchmarking data that's more recent than the pandemic.
Yeah, I'll start, and Matt, if you want to add, you can. So we're in the middle of negotiations, so I have to be careful with what I share. We hope to, and we feel we must. We're a half of the equation, but we have a very good relationship with our union. And so we feel closing that out prior to this vote will be essential. So I'm just naming that. What we want, yes, we've done the benchmarking, and it's been the pieces that we brought into negotiations. And what I can say is the spirit on both sides. First of all, you didn't see in our override asks anything that kind of indicates things related to what was done in the past. So that's a data point for you. The other piece is that we said we want to be equitable internally, meaning across the whole scale. We want to be equitable, right? So everyone, if there's a ranking, wherever Natick is the same across the scale, but also competitive externally. So I'm answering your question as safely as I feel I can, given that we're open in negotiations, but Matt, if you want to add to that.
No, there isn't a whole lot really more to add to that, but the only thing I would say is, like, historically, we've spent just below the state average in per pupil spending, and so that kind of gives you a hint of where we're at in the aggregate, and our teachers aren't all that far off from that. We just can't elaborate because we're in negotiations, and we're hoping and trying to nudge to settle, soon, so we have a firm number for what our budget's going to be for next year before the school committee has to vote it and before town meeting.
Thank you. I'll just say that I continue to believe that our teachers are an undervalued resource in our district, and I would hate to see any more pressure put on them that really pushes them out the door, because I think they're tremendous. Follow-up question about the impact on students with disabilities. I noticed several of those positions and the reference to some of these IEP services being mandated. If we are to cut those positions and these services are required, are we pushing these students to a place where they are then eligible for out-of-district placement and then just trading costs from one bucket to another that we're required to pay, as opposed to providing them the services that they're entitled to in district?
So I'll take that one first. So we take a careful look at our caseloads, as well as with the special ed department and director of pupil services, what we can do kind of going forward, and what trade-offs we can potentially make. So yes, we are obligated to provide the services, but the IEPs get updated each year. And to put it in the simplest terms I can, one of the unwritten goals of special education is to try to put themselves out of business. We want to get the student away from needing services. We want to grow those skills and abilities so that they don't need special services, and we do make progress with that. I know it doesn't always seem like it in the aggregate with the way we showed the growth, but it's something that we factored in with all of the reductions we were making. There really isn't a kind of bucket or group of things that didn't get touched in everything we looked at. We really went at it in a discussion we had with the union, with the union leadership and the heads up. They called it surgical. And we took that as a compliment, because we try to take care knowing that every student's going to be here for 1 year. You only want to go through the 4th grade once. You only want to go through 11th grade once. So we always try to make it the best year we can for everybody. And we still think we can honor those agreements. It's just some different people will be helping provide those services.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I'm going to give a bit of the spirit message to that. To make very clear, we have not cut in that plan any mandated services, to be unequivocally clear. The other thing is, we teach all students. That is such a firm belief. That is what public education is. And so I hope we keep all kids in district. And I hope that we give them the very, very best experience, no matter who they are. And so, even in my interviews when I came here, I spoke about my belief in inclusion and my belief in belonging for all students. And so to me, that has to do with special education as well. So there's nothing cut that's mandated, and we will serve our kids, and we will analyze what they need, as we always have done. And if we had to make different choices, we would. It doesn't mean that number's going to get bigger. It means, just as we always do, we juggle the resources that we have. So I think that's important to say on top of what Matt said.
Hi, I'm Shantanu Inamdar. I'm 13 Vernon Road, resident of Natick since 2017 now. I have a kid in high school and one in middle school, so this comes straight from somebody who's going to be impacted should this happen or not. And I really appreciate the transparency here. If I understand it correctly, right, we are here because we've been, over a long period of time, let's say, we have been adding services which we now find ourselves not able to sustain. So that's the assumption I'm making. Please correct me if I'm wrong in that assumption. which means, this was known before COVID. So this is a chronic problem, not an acute thing that happened over the last 6 months, and now we end up in a tricky situation. So if this is the case, then really how do we avoid such a situation going forward at all? Yes, we have the override questions over the next 2 months. The town will vote, the decisions will be made, we'll react to it. But what gets lost in all of that is how did we get here? And how do I make sure for the next at least 20 years we are not having this conversation again, and Natick as a school district and as a town is not at this stage? How do you plan for such a thing going forward?
So I heard a two-part question. The first was about, have we been adding services that we can no longer sustain? I think that's one question. And the second one is, how do we go forward?
So I'll start just to try to answer those two questions. And I'll also start with just your sort of take on the overall situation. I've been working for the town for 10 years now, almost 10 years in different capacities. And the dialogue about an override has been part of the dialogue for the last 10 years. Right before the pandemic hit, actually, the select board was completely different composition, so don't say anything to these current members, but they were about to vote on a potential override at that point. I believe the number was 6.5-ish million. John was actually working on some of that information at that time. Pandemic hit. For good reason, the community put that conversation on pause. So that's certainly something that has been new. I know in my time as TA, which has been about 4 years, in my budget message every year, I talk about the idea that we have this structural deficit that was largely inherited. It's been going on for many years, and we need to address it. And an override is one potential way, or we have to cut services. Our proposal is to address it with an override rather than cut services. In our opinion, we do feel that the current services that largely is, an override would help level service are what we've heard through the years are priorities of the community. If I could predict the future for what's happened in the next 20 years, I'd probably retire tomorrow and say, good luck, Natick, but I'm not going to do that because I really do. I've been working for 10 years, and I want to continue to work here. It's a great community to work for. I'm a strong proponent of schools myself and the town services that we provide. I have 3 kids in a nearby community school system, including a high schooler and 2 middle schoolers. So I know how important schools are to a community and what they mean to just building community. And in our opinion, this is an approach that we're asking to move forward, and what we're saying is necessary to keep the services that this community has asked for and prioritized through the years. Moving forward from this point, I know on the town side, what we've talked a lot about is how can, in the budget presentation on December 16th, there was a dialogue around there's a fiscal benefit coming our way in fiscal year 2030. It's when a liability comes off of books that's related to retirement pension liability. And our goal really with this override is to not necessarily just bridge the gap, but to help us get to that point where we're going to have that additional resource coming in. It's an expense, but then that'll be really that 1 year flip will give us some additional resource. So part of the benefit of doing an override now is it gets us to that 2030 point where we can then plan between now and then to ensure that come 2030 we're best positioned to ensure that we're not going back out to the voters at that point for an operational override. Will that then last another 10 years? We'd have to really do good planning now with this team, with this leadership team, to make sure that we can. And I trust in this team. I think we can. I'm confident that we can. But really predicting the future is a challenge for all of us to do. I think it's in our best interest to ensure that we're transparent with the public so you see what we're working with. And moving forward, I want to make sure that we're even continuing to be transparent on okay, here's what we anticipated, here's what we're actually seeing as actual costs, because next year, we could see other different mandates coming from federal or state governments, or we could see drops in revenue. We do rely heavily on state and federal dollars for some of the services we provide in the schools and otherwise. If those increase over the next year, great. If those decrease over the next year, well, we have to find other sources to offset those, or those are programs that need to go away. So some of this is hard to predict for the next 20 years, but I am confident that we can, with this team, be much more transparent and be able to show all of you really the value that you're getting for your money, which in my opinion is very high quality services at a high value in the Eastern Massachusetts.
If I could just expand on that. So your first question, Elise, was, that we grew?
That we've been adding services over time, and it seems that we can no longer sustain them.
To a certain extent, yes. The answer is yes. We have added some staff, but some of the reason we add that staff is because our students' needs change. So when the superintendent says we're public, it's really zip code and age-based. If you live in town and you're within the school age, we're obligated to provide the services to meet the individual student's needs. So that represents a part of the growth. Some of the growth we've already started to sort of pare back because we understand, or at least we believe we have a decent understanding of the town's ability to pay. And so we're trying to do that with the least amount of impact on student achievement and quality student services that we're going to provide. Right? Is there anything else you want to add?
I think it's worth it just because we have it to go to slide, since you're there, 15. Oh, yeah, I can do that. So this has been our staffing trend for the last 7 years. You can see that we dropped 36 positions coming into this year. And that was, I think, quite a credit to the interim superintendent who was in place last year, who made some of those changes, and to the whole team. And as you've heard, we have a plan already, which is, to Karen's point earlier, not level servicing, but reductions to less than level servicing of 10. So that's another 10 from here. So I think we're making a good trend in recognizing kind of doing some right sizing. And you can see kind of a summary of the types of positions that we've been adding, which has kind of been to meet the needs of our student base. So staffing, by the way, is 80%. Compensation is 80% of a school's budget. And so that's why we're focusing on this. I could talk about the other 20%. It's mainly driven by staffing. And so staffing increases were focused on the needs of all kids with added interventions. We talked about that. I talked about those interventionists that we have that wouldn't be here any longer if the override doesn't pass. Those support general education, by the way. That's for all kids to kind of avoid getting to a place, to catch it early. In addition, reducing special education placements, addressing social and emotional needs, expanding the roles for counselors, assistant principals, ancillary providers. Ancillary providers means occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy. And then reducing class sizes to support individualized learning. So those are sort of where the money went with the scale up. And then I'm going to actually show you, a slide we wrote just as, again, what I call a spirit message, that we're committed to transparency. I hope you see that here tonight. Fiscal responsibility, when we say we are already prepared to cut $2 million through next year, that is what fiscal responsibility is, and balanced budgeting. And we wrote this commitment in terms of that we're committed to running a fiscally responsible school system that works collaboratively with the town to explore budget-neutral, innovative solutions. At the same time, we're committed to attracting and retaining talented staff. They're the gems of our system. We want to keep them. They're essential in providing students and families with high-quality academic and social-emotional experiences. We want the kids to feel that they have a great time in Natick Public Schools and they learn a lot. So we're committed to that in line with the town's available funds. That's critical. We need to be a partner to the town and deliver budgets that are in line with that. And we want to mention here that that requires significant efficiency because our compensation, which I just said is 80% of our budget, driven by the cost of living adjustments, step increases, so every year a teacher goes up a step, and if they get more education, they go across a lane. It's a matrix. That represents about 6.8% increase. So if we went, let's say, to a 5% or a 4%, we're already having to find productivity of 1.8 or 2.8 points. So that's important to understand with a budget like this. But we have a commitment to wanting to make sure we're working alongside the town to be responsible. I think we've demonstrated that heavily in the last 2 years with $2 million of cuts.
Thank you all for these presentations and again for the transparency. My question is, what percentage, well, actually two questions. I'll give both and you can take them as you wish. What percentage of the budget is the proposed override compared to the last override of FY 2009? And then my second question is, there have been remarks about trying to fix the structural deficit. And the gentleman asked the question here about, fixing that. But with Prop 2.5, is that possible? Is it possible to fix the structural deficit?
Excellent questions. I don't know if you can pull up the presentation from the 16th, but there's slide 30 shows the comparison between the FY 2009 override versus the $8 million proposal that still is yet to be voted by the select board for 2026, FY 2026. And it's approximately 3.88 in 2009, 4.03, and that's the percent of the operating budget. I believe that's answering that first question. And then the second question is, with Prop 2.5, is it possible to basically stay without the need for an operational override? Prop 2.5, when you add new growth, typically equates to about a 3 to 3.5% increase annually. Some years it can be more, some years it can be less. It really depends on how much investment is happening within the community for new growth. I'm having John nod his head, so just so I'm in the right ballpark. When you see increases, and just in the prior slide from the superintendent, of a 6.8% increase for compensation for 80% of a school district, yeah, it's very, very challenging unless you have cuts to be within, and schools are about 65 to 70% of the town budget. And even on the town side, 80+% of our costs, non-school costs, are also salary. It's the people. It's people that drives a lot of what we do, a lot of what we're doing here. And they're also collectively, most of those are collectively bargained, about 350 to 400 employees on the town side. Only about 70 are non-union employees. We have 10 unions technically on the town side that we negotiate collective bargains with, so they are contracted agreements. It is extremely challenging, if not, unless there's additional revenue sources or additional expense reductions, to stay within the Prop 2.5 realities of budgeting.
Thank you.
You want to hand it behind you? Yeah.
We're on. Oh, hi. Thanks. My name is Dave Margill. I live over in Precinct 8. Earlier, it was mentioned that even without the override, the budgets of both the town and the schools were going to increase. And I'm curious to know, my sense of the presentation is that those increases are driven not so much by adding things, because it sounds like both the town and the schools are not adding service in a no override scenario, but I'm assuming is that inflation caused those required increases just to do what the no override scenario requires? And then a sort of an addendum to that question, how much does the impact of increasing healthcare costs affect your projections?
So I'm going to have Matt address the main drivers, but I want to again say that we're about 10 days prior to the actual budget being delivered, where it will be so clear where all those pieces are, but he might be able to give kind of a 30,000-foot view of the drivers. And then I think Jamie will take the next question.
Yep.
So in a large, operation like the schools in town, like it's a $200 million operation where we've got staff on salary schedules, like the status quo is a myth, right? It doesn't really exist because even if we didn't have a settled contract or it was a flat zero, if you're a teacher on step 7, today, next year you go to step 8. So there's going to be some raise there. Our contracts, with multi-year contracts with our service providers that bid them out, they usually include an increase over time. So whether that's a 2 or 3%, or if it's like our transportation contract, which I want to say is 5.4 or something, we go from $470 a day for a bus to $495 a day for a bus, right? That's that's just to maintain kind of the same level of service. We expect to have the same number of kids in town. We expect to run the same number of buses. So that's going to cost more. If staff have another year of experience and you have contracts that negotiate and set what that is, then we're going to have to pay them something a little bit more. So it's near impossible to stay at zero. The way you keep the kind of costs down, which isn't really good for overall service, is to have a lot of turnover. But then you've got a lot of other things where people are trying to figure out the past and how we got here and learn everything and come up to speed. And so that's not really desirable either. So, and I'll just say to the earlier question about, how do we know the override would work? It would work for a certain period of time, if done reasonably well. It doesn't work in perpetuity, but it is a new amount added to the base. So assuming we're not using it all in year 1, that gives us time for it to work until we, would get to 2030, where the town's pension obligation, is getting close to coming off the books, and that money could be spent on a variety of other things.
So to provide a little bit of additional context, thank you, Matt, for that great context on sort of the school department and other costs. With no override, and I brought up this slide just to show the FY26 budgeted column is assuming no override. We basically just put that out there as we're going to budget for no override. You'll see school, and this is just what was presented also tonight, goes from 87 roughly million to 92 million roughly, a 6.29% increase. The town goes from 47 to 46, roughly a minus 1.2, and then shared services 56.9 to 58.9, which is approximately a 3.61% increase. That increase is partially healthcare. It's also partially insurance. It's also partially just our debt service, because we do have existing borrowing on the books that we have to pay for. Even if we do nothing, we're obligated to pay those. So it's a combination of things in the shared services. On the town side, the reduction we feel we can handle is basically because of cuts to staff and other budget lines. So it's really a net negative over year. With an override, it's really only 1.07% increase because it's basically just level services, and we're finding efficiencies to still accommodate increases in compensation that we're obligated to pay per the union contracts that we have, and also just to retain high quality staff. But to your point about healthcare, that is in the shared services line. What we've seen over the last several years, and I'm looking at John Marshall, who's handling, we're part of a consortium for healthcare. It's called the West Suburban Health Group. And they've worked over the last several years coming out of the pandemic with the loss of Fallon in the market to help understand and absorb as much of the cost as possible. We've still seen roughly anywhere from 7 to 10% increases the last several years to healthcare. Now, what also drives healthcare is just number of employees that are employed. So if we were to, for example, have no override and reduce our staffing, we'll actually see a net decrease, even though healthcare costs are projected to go up anywhere from 6 to 10% next year, because we'll have fewer staff members in theory on our plans. Now, even if we have level staff, we still might see fluctuations in our healthcare costs because some people come onto the plan, some people come off the plan, some people have families. All of that factors into the healthcare costs, so that's even more challenging for us to predict. We try to, as much as possible, use actuals heading into the budgeting process. So in December, January, we actually look at actuals and then look at the trends to try to best guesstimate into the future year. We won't actually have our healthcare cost numbers, though, until February timeframe, mid-February. And so that's why we have a preliminary budget February 1, and then we do an updated budget March or April, depending on when we get those costs. Usually it's at the end of March. So these costs are definitely a factor in our budgeting process and definitely been an impact over the last several years as healthcare increases, for sure. John, do you want to add anything to that?
Just the little box on the side there, numbers subject to change.
So number subject to change, and that's true with all of our override dialogue. State aid update. So state aid, we do get about $18 to $20 million annually in state aid, correct? 18 to 20 about. Hopefully it increases. It usually does. Usually it's about, on average, a 3+% increase. We had 1 year during the pandemic was more than that, but that's not what we use as our typical average. But we won't know state aid. We'll get a preliminary governor's budget, but sometimes we don't even know final state aid until August, when the state budget actually is finalized. Health insurance rates, that's directly in the budget. That's definitely, or directly in that box. That's absolutely a factor that could impact budgeting for a future fiscal year. And these are true almost every single fiscal year. It's just more acutely true this year because of the request. And then pension contribution requirements. We do have annual contribution requirements of about $12 to $13 million. It's based on an actuarial study completed by the retirement board, the Natick Retirement Board, which is technically a separate entity from the town. That's currently being updated, but this current fiscal year, I think it was about 13.4 million-ish. That could go up, that could go down based on that actuarial study. That's the pension liability that was mentioned will be funded in 2030 by FY 2030 that will then come, not fully, it's not as if 14 or 13 million are going to come into our coffers. It'll probably go down to maybe a $2 or $3 million item based on, again, the actuarial study. But that'll be a significant savings that year. But that's when it gets fully funded.
Cody Jacobs. I'm a resident of Natick. So I have two questions. I'll just ask them both for the sake of efficiency. The first one is with respect to the schools. You mentioned some areas that are currently strengths of ours that would suffer in the event of some of these cuts, and I'm curious about areas that we've identified as areas for potential improvement and how those might be affected if our plans for improvement might be affected if these cuts go through. And then my second question is sort of a broader one, but given what Jamie explained about the relationship between free cash and capital and how next year if we don't do any or do very little of our capital program this year, next year we'd have even more needs, and I assume over time those needs for vehicles and maintenance would grow more and more acute, that we would have further tension between using free cash for operations in future years and using it for capital. And so essentially, if we vote no on the override, we would not just be looking at the cuts that are in this presentation, but we'd be looking at more operational cuts the next year and the next year and the next year, if that's correct. So those are my two questions. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Sorry. This is heavier than you'd think. Thanks, Cody. So improvements, we've already said that we're going from level servicing to below level servicing. So I think they're not very much a difference from what I already said. So for instance, I'm worried about being able to buy high quality curricular materials related to our literacy audit. I rolled out a literacy audit in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where we had over 50% multilingual learners in our classes, a higher percentage of special education, a great deal of need around literacy. It was not cheap. And it moved our scores significantly. It was like maybe my favorite data point that I carry from my prior district. So I know a strategic literacy plan can be so monumentally effective, and you think about that, that's for our youngest learners. That means they carry that literacy across the curriculum through the entire experience they have in the school. So to me, every Natick student deserves it. And so I'm a little worried about the curriculum purchases. There's a lot of cuts there. I'm thinking about how we deploy a tight instructional vision. There's so much strong here, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for cohesion. Much of what I'm talking about, hopefully you'll all come to the entry plan when we review the findings. But instructional vision and kind of alignment takes the alignment of a bunch of different pieces of staff to kind of push it through a system. And so I'm worried about the cuts of those 39 to 41 people and how we make sure they can do that while taking on higher workload. If we cut 10 to 12 teachers, that will impact their workload, their stress levels. That's just very real. Many of you probably work in places where you've taken on some work when somebody else leaves. We all have gone through times like that. I don't want that to happen for our teachers because honestly, I think they've been incredible partners in this journey of the story I told you here today. We did not make this in a bubble up at central office. There is no more like ivory tower there. We don't want it. And so we did it in conjunction with teachers. So that PD, professional development, instruction, curricular materials worries me. I also want to respect what I've heard from the school committee. They are so dedicated, and the stories they tell of what they've been able to do over the last many years, I want to protect. I think they know Natick better than I do, and I'm very grateful to be learning from them, and I want to protect what they built. And so I think they might even have a tighter story than I do about that, but protecting those smaller class sizes, protecting the extracurricular, the club, the experiences of our students, the beautiful athletics that we all care about because we're at the football games, right? Or whatever, the music, the theater, whatever it is. We want to protect that experience. I think that's the main thing. I think I have other ideas that I'll call like reorg-ish, but to me, my job, based on the commitment I just read, is to make that fairly budget neutral. That is what I would aim to do. So that's how I would answer that question.
To the second question, to just reiterate what I heard was basically by deferring the capital with no override, we're going to have impacts not only on capital the future, but also operational costs the next year. Short answer is absolutely yes. But the longer answer is our capital program is robust because Natick is a good-sized town with strong facilities and strong needs and high services, high-quality services at high value. With an impact on capital, that will not only impact, or with no override, will not only impact the staffing that you've heard tonight and sort of student or public-facing components, but also our ability to actually provide services. Because if we have issues with our buildings, if we have issues with our vehicle fleets, our ability to provide those services, even if we have fewer staff, is also going to be further hindered and further impacted. Like even just this building today, when we had the fire alarm box system, we were concerned, could we even hold this meeting tonight? With impacts to our facilities, it could impact because deferred maintenance means impacts not only real time during the day to be able to provide the services that we want to provide on a daily basis, but also long-term costs, because it costs more to do something down the road than it would cost if we can do it while it comes to the end of its useful life. We just recently, for example, had our boilers fail unexpectedly in a community services department, community senior center, that we had to do an emergency procurement for that was not initially planned. It was planned for an outer year, but it wasn't planned for this year. We had to upfront that cost and actually do that work just recently. That happens daily for us because, and we're trying to get ahead of it, but just because the demands and the benefits or the needs for our capital program are pretty great, you know? And that's because I think this town has done a great job at investing in buildings, investing in services, and putting priority to services provided to the community. Debt exclusions are also, what are you going to say about that? Oh, correct. Yep. An approach for capital would be to use debt exclusions, which we already currently use for many of our building projects. Debt exclusions, as opposed to Prop 2.5, I provided slides on Prop 2.5, which is really about operational increases. Debt exclusion basically means for a given project or set of projects, again, you get a vote of the voters to help fund that project. And then at the end of that project, for example, build a new school, you borrow for 20 years to cover that school costs, or the West Natick Fire Station is a good example, the Kennedy Middle School, those are recent debt exclusion votes. Those then get added to the tax roll, but then they come off once that debt service is paid. we'd likely have to shift a lot of our capital program to that type of approach, which gets even more challenging because a capital program is so fluid and the demands come up over the course of a year. Like I just mentioned, this building, community senior center, school buildings, we need a little more flexibility in our capital program and debt exclusions from the typical capital program. It makes sense for big projects like school building projects or town building projects, but for the capital program, it's extremely challenging to have the flexibility and the fluidity that we need in that program to be able to handle the ongoing capital work. So that's why we prefer it having being more of the annualized budgeting process.
We have time for one more question. Is there, yes, sir, or ma'am?
Hi, my name's Jen Gory. I'm a resident of Natick. I was wondering if you could talk to more the impact of the cuts on the high school experience. It mentioned that, for example, that some of the AP classes would have to shift to online. Would that mean that the students would be taking AP classes without a relationship with an NPS teacher? And would the other high school teacher cuts mean that some students might struggle to meet the requirements, like meet their graduation requirements with the level of rigor they're looking for? So I was wondering if you could expand on like what that input would look like for high school students.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I think, so the devil's in the details, and I hope I never have to do the details because I think there'll be some great analysis with input from staff, from students when we build that plan. But we know by cutting 10 to 12 people, many of whom would be at the high school, it would absolutely affect. I know other communities, including the one I live in, including my stepson, who was offered to take AP Psych online because it was part of a cut, and he elected not to because it was going to be such a different experience. And so that's just basically when the demand is low for a given class, or in that case for my stepson, they couldn't fill one class. They had an overflow into another class because there was more demand than one class, and so they ended up having to put it online. It's just a very different experience that many of us have learned online or even worked online and kind of know that feeling. So when I say the devil's in the details, I can't tell you how many AP classes it would be, we would do as little as we could because we always want to do right by students. But by cutting that many people would absolutely affect it. We would never not prepare a program of studies that graduated our students with rigorous content. We would never do that. So again, I can't answer it specifically without saying we would analyze it, but we just know those would be the impacts. People will be learning in bigger classes. People will be possibly not being offered their preferences, right? So a schedule, you imagine the matrix that makes up a schedule at the high school. Kids have lots of preferences, and it's going to be restricted in how we can schedule the high school with less people, less teachers in it. So that worries me a little bit too. I mean, this is all from the high school principal, Ms. Blocker, who she and I kind of talked at length about it today, and she was pretty emphatic that kids would just have less of their preferences, less of if they choose this is first, this is second, this is third, less people would get their first or second choice. That's disappointing, right? When you want to be part of a high quality career time at high school, and when you only do that once. So less diversity in class offerings, less one-on-one with the teachers in some cases, less preferred pieces. I think we'd offer as many APs, that's our high school, but they might not all be in person. Did I answer the whole question? Okay.
So thank you, Dr. Spash, Mr. Erickson, Mr. Townsend, and Mr. Gillis. We really appreciate you answering questions from the public today. Thank you, everybody, for coming here today. The themes that I heard today, and I'll focus on the school side, were that either scenario, an override scenario or a non-override scenario, we're looking at less than level service to our students and our families, and that's of concern to me as a school committee member. The schools have already cut $2 million in this fiscal year and have planned cuts for next year. Without an override, we would be losing up to 40 student-facing positions, including up to 12 teachers. We want to retain our teachers. I heard that theme definitely from folks in the audience. We want to meet our student needs. There's been a growth in certain types of interventionists, counselors, assistant principals that have arisen since COVID to meet the needs, the increased needs of our students. We wanted to reduce class sizes so they could get more attention. All of that would be in jeopardy by a no override vote. I've heard some questions about what the budget drivers are, and I think we're all looking forward to the budget presentation when we'll get more granular detail about that. And I invite everybody to come to the school committee meetings where we're going to be discussing our budget and asking more questions there related to the school budget. And I think I'll hand it over to Catherine.
Elise has pretty much covered many of the themes. Some of the themes of questions regarding the town side were, again, what are the drivers? The question about the potential for another override before 2030. Mr. Erickson had mentioned that an underride is possible. I wanted to just mention that over the last 36 fiscal years throughout the entire state, there have been 16 underrides, 2 of which lost, which is interesting. And 7 of those were over $1 million. So it is possible, and my hope is that our house is in order in 2030, so when that $18 million OPEB obligation, that's about what it is a year, right? 12 to 13. When that drops off, we'll have some excess tax levy. And that combined with the financial policies which have been adopted and put in place over the last year and a half and other additional financial policies that we're contemplating, we'll be in a very good position going forward. So I just wanted to sum that up. Our next steps, opportunities for engagement. We have 3 upcoming meetings and forums. So on February 3rd, the Select Board, the School Committee, and the Finance Committee will meet to present the budget. The budget will be it'll be released that day, so there won't be a lot of time to review it before the meeting, and the meeting will take place at the beginning of a regularly scheduled school committee meeting. So there won't be a lot of discussion about it, but we'll have it in hand. We'll be able to go through it. On February 11th will be public forum number 2, the Community Senior Center between 7 and 8:30 p.m. And then the 3rd public forum will be March 12th at Morse Library, probably down here again between 7 and 8:30 p.m. The Select Board will meet after the budget is presented on the 3rd. Our next immediate meeting is February 5th. And I think that the board will require a little bit more time to go through it. So I am tentatively scheduling the Select Board meeting to vote whether to put the override on the ballot on Wednesday, February 12th at 6:30 p.m. That's a non-regularly scheduled meeting. There's newsletters, frequently asked questions. The staff are turning around the questions that are being submitted as quickly as possible. So stay tuned for notices of school committee engagement sessions, and also the Finance Committee will be, after the budget has been presented, the subcommittees will start to hold meetings. Those are public meetings, and I know that they're in progress of putting that calendar together. All of those meetings will be on the town website. If you've signed up for override meeting notices, you'll get an email with regard to those meetings. And I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's very cold. And thank you to our staff for being so well prepared and answering our questions. Thank you so much.